Discover the incredible moment a janitor reveals a hidden solution that transforms a CEO's panic. In the glittering chaos of Manhattan, George Wallace was simply another invisible cog in the corporate machine. At 45, a janitor by trade and a dreamer by choice, his days and nights were wrapped in the same dull garment of routine. Every evening found him mopping floors of offices where people whispered of fortunes that could be made and business deals that could change lives. A sense of disconnection unfurled in George's chest, an ache for better opportunities for his wife and 2 children, yet here he was, laboring in shadows while the world thrived obliviously. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Corporate whispers wafted through the glass walls as Mark, the ambitious CEO, spiraled into an abyss of panic. The failed product launch had sent shockwaves through the firm, leaving him grappling with the impending threat of layoffs. Control slipped through his fingers like elusive sand. Days of sleepless nights, fueled by anxiety and pressure, morphed into frantic scribbles on spreadsheets as he wrestled demons of failure and isolation. Torn from his family's embrace, his heart was a battleground of fears. Could he bear the weight of his employees' livelihoods as well as the discontent of his own family? As George pushed his mop across the polished floor, the unwelcome noise of his thoughts drowned out the sounds of a city that never stopped moving. Was this what his life amounted to? Endless sweeping and empty dreams? Heart racing, he caught sight of Mark deep in despair across the conference room, buried under pressure, yet seeming so familiar. Suddenly, their eyes met. George felt the heaviness swell in the space between them, an unspoken urgency rising. He hesitated, the mop hovering midair, battling an instinctual pull to shatter the boundary of status. Before we continue, I need to tell you about something important that's happening. YouTube has been making changes to the system, and many people are losing notifications from channels they follow. If you're enjoying the content, click the bell and mark all notifications so you don't miss the next videos. And if you can leave a like, it really helps with reach. Seriously, it makes a difference. Oh, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to know who's on the other side of the screen. Now, let's continue. With a single breath, George approached the desolate CEO. Words spilled forth, raw, vulnerable, and unexpected. He revealed an idea rooted in the authenticity of daily struggles, speaking to a market clamoring for connection, for stories that mattered. Mark's initial scoff echoed at George's mind, a fleeting reminder of the divide separating them. Yet as desperation gripped him tighter, Mark's skepticism began to waver, giving way to curiosity and the faintest flicker of hope. But just as they sparked a fragile alliance, the fear crept back into Mark's heart.
Investors were tightening their grip, yanking him back towards safer waters, more conventional angles that could protect the bottom line. Would he cling to George's unorthodox concept that tugged at his soul, or surrender to the cold demands of failing expectations? George sensed the tide turning and felt that familiar dread swell anew. Could he really trust this man in front of him, who stood at the crossroads of entrepreneurship and humanity? And Mark, with every heartbeat, memories of home haunted him, of family dinners and laughter muted by the relentless pursuit of success. The conference room, once a sanctuary of opportunity, felt like a cage closing in. As the clock continued to tick and tension thickened the air, it became evident this was more than a professional dilemma. It was an echo of values lost. Steeling himself, Mark stood teetering on the edge of decision, realizing the weight of legacy pressing down on him. Would he summon the courage to confront his fear, to champion the heart behind George's vision? The stakes had never felt higher, and with every passing second, the silent room awaited the reckoning, dying to know. Would a weary janitor's insight become a catalyst for redemption, or fade with the cubicle lights? The silence in the conference room stretched like a caught wire, each moment heavy with unexpressed hopes and fears. George stared intently at Mark, searching for signs of recognition, the faintest acknowledgement that his bold leap into the unknown could lead to something tangible. Was it ridiculous to think a simple idea, birthed from his daily grind, could stem the tide of disaster threatening Mark's empire? The clock ticked rhythmically, each second drawing George deeper into contemplation. Casual conversations and banter he'd overheard in the gleaming offices around him had always felt so distant, yet there he stood, throwing open the door to the possibility of change. He was just a janitor in a suit and tie world, yet here was a sliver of hope, one that could shift their trajectories entirely. Mark's furrowed brow suggested internal chaos. George could see the back and forth playing out in his mind, embracing the chaos or retreating back to the safe and known path. The stakes weren't only corporate, they were personal. Lives hung in the balance. Not just George's dream of a better life for his family,
but Mark's vision for his company and its people. It struck George how intertwined their fates had suddenly become. As uncertainty gnawed at Mark, George felt undulating waves of urgency urging him to press further. "What do you have to lose, Mark?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just a janitor, but I know what customers are feeling. People crave authenticity. They want to connect, not just buy." At that moment, clarity washed over George like a cleansing tide. He realized that there was more to him than mops and floors.
The capacity to perceive the world around him was sharp. He understood the unvoiced yearnings of people who might feel just as lost as he did. He'd been a listener all his life, observing nuances often overlooked by those consumed by their ambitions. His own fears had weighed him down for too long, like debris obstructing the current in a stream. Perhaps Mark needed to confront his own trepidations, just as he had stepped up to confront the enormity of his circumstances. It was a shared vulnerability, a raw honesty they both needed to embrace to navigate forward together. The idea blossoming in George's mind was not merely a desperation move. It was a call to honesty, a rallying cry to trust the unexpected. Mark needed to hear it, needed to confront that which held him captive. What if you took a chance on me, on what could disrupt the norm? You talk about people leaving a legacy. Why not leave one where you truly connect with your audience? Mark's eyes flickered. A tempest of fear and determination danced within them. He brought a shaky hand to his chin, contemplating George's words, as his heart raced in response to this unprecedented crossroads. The moment held an electric charge. It was a negotiation of faith. Could he step away from the familial restraints of corporate rigidity and trust the vision of a janitor? But just as George felt a rush of optimism swell within him, the harsh ping of a notification from Mark's phone cut through the hopeful connection. An urgent message from investors flashed on the screen, summoning him back to the realities of a crumbling empire and the demands of survival. Would Mark be able to step outside of his comfort zone? Would he give weight to George's vision when tethered so tightly to the fears of failure? Time hung heavily as Mark's expression morphed from contemplation to resignation. George found himself plagued by an overwhelming sense of anticipation, a gut-wrenching fight against despair. Angle of possibility narrowed, and doubt thickened the air. Would Mark rise to the occasion or retreat into safety? George had opened the door, but would the CEO step through it? The answer felt just out of reach, and with it, the revelation that would shape their destinies hung softly in the balance. Mark's gaze dropped to his phone, the bright glow illuminating the lines etched on his forehead. The urgency in the message wasn't lost on George, who could see the slightest shift in Mark's posture, the way his shoulders slumped, a tangible weight pressing down on him. It was a familiar sight, one George had witnessed countless times in the break room after a particularly daunting day. It suddenly struck him that Mark wasn't just a CEO in that instant. He was a man, a person feeling the full force of the winds of adversity. "Let me ask you something," George said, pushing through the tension like a hot knife through butter. "What if this moment right now isn't just about survival?
What if it's a chance to build something real, something that matters?" The flicker of curiosity sparked in Mark's eyes, the tiniest crack where possibility might seep through. George could feel his own heartbeat quicken, a surge of determination igniting within him. "I'm not asking you to abandon reason. I'm asking you to reassess it. You've seen what happens when a company loses its grip on authenticity. You've felt the backlash. Your customers, they can sense when a brand is out of touch." Mark took a breath, dismissing George's passion with a slight shake of his head, but George refused to let this moment slip away. "Think about it, Mark," he pressed on, his thoughts unraveling into words without filter. "What if you approached this not like a CEO, but like a fellow dreamer? You're afraid of failure, and I get that. We're all afraid. I've lived in that fear every day of my life. But do you know what I've realized? Fear is a catalyst. It can either paralyze you or push you to innovate." In that moment, Mark's expression shifted again, from skeptical to introspective. George wasn't just speaking to his heart, he was touching the core of his experience. He saw a man who had meticulously crafted a life, only to realize it could all come undone. That fear resonated with George far deeper than any professional encounter. "I'm just a janitor, yes," George continued, his voice steady despite the nervous tremor beneath. "But you want to be remembered as more than just a name on a building, don't you?
Imagine connecting with customers not through faceless marketing, but through genuine stories, real interactions. Allow your vision to reflect honesty, and your audience will rally around that. Mark's eyes softened. For a brief moment, they reflected understanding, energy, and an inkling of hope. But could he truly embrace this pivot? The clock continued ticking, a relentless reminder that time was slipping through their fingers. A shattering realization struck George. Perhaps Mark wasn't the only one who needed to step into the unknown. He needed to, too. This wasn't merely a pitch, it was a commitment to his own development. He was presenting a vision not solely for Mark's company, but for his own life, weaving authenticity into the tapestry of their shared destiny. As the tension thickened like fog in the room, George's mind raced ahead, strategically mapping the potential paths forward if they decided to embrace the risk. But would Mark respond to the challenge, or would he retreat back into the corporate machinery that had offered him a life of safety, but entwined him within the chains of his own fears? Are you willing to trust something beyond spreadsheets and metrics? George asked, resolute in his intent. Or will you fold under the pressures that threaten to drown your legacy? A fragile silence enveloped them, the air taut with unvoiced possibilities.
Would Mark seize this moment, or would he fade into the background of yet another missed opportunity? The answer hung precariously, a precipice waiting for a choice. Just then, Mark's phone chimed again, this time with the unmistakable urgency of an incoming call. As he stared down at the screen, George could almost hear the ticking clock reignite in the back of his mind, a reminder that, in the world of business and life, time was the one currency that could not be reclaimed. Would this next decision mark the turning point in both of their lives? George watched Mark's tension ripple through the silence, the CEO's face a mask of conflict as he stared at the phone. The moment stretched, each second heavy with unspoken words. What could Mark be considering? Would he let the pressure drive him back to old habits, or would he dare to step into the unknown? With a deep breath, Mark finally swiped the screen, glancing at the caller ID. "It's the board," he muttered, the weight of dread lacing his voice. "If I don't answer, then what? They'll continue down a path that leads to nowhere?" George interjected, his mind racing. "This could be the moment that changes everything for you and the company. Isn't that worth the risk?" Mark hesitated, torn between obligation and potential. George could see the internal battle play out, a clash of corporate expectations against a fresh spark of possibility. "You're not just a janitor, George," he replied softly, disbelief coloring his words. "You don't understand what's at stake here." "On the contrary," George countered, stepping into the fray. "I understand fear all too well. I've always felt like I was at the bottom of the totem pole, just cleaning up after the mess." He gestured around the office, the glint of fluorescent lights reflecting off polished surfaces. "But I've realized something. The most powerful transformations come from the ground level. So let's do something radical. Decline the call. Just for now. Let's figure out what matters first." Mark looked deeply into George's eyes, searching for any trace of doubt. All he found was conviction. Then, almost imperceptibly, he set the phone down on the desk, the urgency of the call suddenly muted against the desperate hope in the air. "What do you think we should do?" Mark asked, his voice steadying. It was a vulnerable admission, surrendering himself to the possibility of change. George felt invigorated by this shift. If Mark would open the door, he would push it wide. You have a chance to rethink everything. The mission, the message, the connections with your clients. We start by sharing stories of real people, acknowledging what this brand truly stands for, rather than parroting clever slogans. We dig into the heart of the company. That's where authenticity is born. The spark began to shift into flames as Mark leaned forward, curiosity glimmering in his eyes. "How do we do that? What if it doesn't work?"
"There are no guarantees," George replied, awareness surging within him. "But the risk of failing to connect with your audience could cost you everything. They need to know you're more than just a face behind a logo. Embrace vulnerability. It's what makes you relatable and human. If you're honest, others will rally behind you." The fervor of their dialogue peeled away layers of corporate jargon, revealing the raw, pulsating truth hidden beneath. Mark's forehead creased in thought, and George sensed the pivotal choice forming in the air. "Maybe I've been so focused on data that I've lost sight of the very people I'm trying to reach," Mark exhaled, clarity breaking through his earlier skepticism. "Exactly," George encouraged, a rush of warmth flooding through him. "Now's the time to channel that into action. What if we set up an initial meeting with your team? We share ideas,
Tell them what you really want for the company. Let them in on this vision. Mark shifted, rummaging through his thoughts, his internal compass redirecting for the first time in years. George's insight felt like a weight lifted, a new direction illuminated. He was realizing what he craved all along was collaboration, a partnership that transcended position. Just as hope began to swell in the room, Mark's phone buzzed insistently again. They both glanced at it, the sound punctuating a moment that held infinite potential. This time, Mark picked it up, deliberating as he reread the caller's identity. Could this be a sign? George thought, apprehension wrapping around him. Mark had made a choice, but would he follow through? Or would he lose his nerve to the siren call of corporate duty? The moment hung in balance, a crossroads emerging. The response that awaited could define not just their destinies, but also the essence of a legacy. Would Mark choose fear or freedom? As Mark's finger hovered over the call button, George felt the heartbeat of transformation thrumming in the air. But in a world where time was a cruel master, the decision would echo beyond the walls of this room. Would courage prevail, or would it retreat into the shadows once more? Mark's finger trembled above the phone, the weight of expectation pressing down on him like a vice. With each second, he designed a future in his mind, one where he truly connected with his team, one where he was more than just a number-crunching CEO. But the tantalizing pull of the board's authority tugged at him, reminding him of his responsibilities, his obligations. George could sense the shift in the air. Mark was surfing a wave of transformation, but it could crash down with a single touch of bureaucracy. "You can't let fear dictate your next move," he murmured, injecting urgency into the encroaching silence. "You're right," Mark finally said, with newfound steadiness.
Setting the phone back down, he experienced a rare moment of clarity, a realization that he could break free from the chains of corporate expectations that had shackled him for so long. This is our opportunity. I can't waste it on a call driven by anxiety. "Let's connect the threads," George asserted, excitement bubbling within him. "We launch a conversation with the team, not just as a directive from the top, but as an open dialogue. Ask for their input, share struggles and aspirations, build trust." Mark nodded slowly, allowing the vision to materialize. "We could hold a workshop or a brainstorming session," he mused, prompting George's enthusiasm. "Even better," George interjected, his voice growing fervent. "Make it a storytelling event. Each team member brings a narrative that reflects their experience with the company. That way, you both lead the conversation, but also allow their voices to share equal weight." As they sat brainstorming ideas together, a vivid image began to take shape in Mark's mind. He could feel the energy shift from dread to collaboration, from the sterile confines of an office to a more vibrant space filled with ideas, aspirations, and courage. This wasn't just about numbers. It was about humanity, about breathing life into the brand through the people who represented it. What if we invited clients too? Mark wondered, his excitement intensifying. They can speak on their experiences with our services. Their feedback could serve as a genuine guide. "Now you're on to something," George agreed, his heart racing. "This could be not just a moment of revelation for you, but a cultural shift for the entire company." Mark leaned back in his chair, a newfound determination flooding through him. It felt surreal, this surge of ownership over the direction of his company, and a fearlessness breaking free from the corporate mold. "I cannot remember the last time I felt this invigorated. I thought being at the top meant thinking for everyone else, but now you're thinking for yourself," George interjected, pride swelling in his chest. "You're allowing vulnerability to guide your leadership. That's a strength, not a weakness." Mark's mind raced, dissecting the fears and anxieties that had once kept him anchored in his position. He realized that the biggest risk was not in embracing this new philosophy, but rather in retreating back into the shadows of previous habits. He was learning the potency of authenticity. However, anxiety flickered like a shadow in the corner of his mind. What if the stories weren't positive? What if the team was more invested in maintaining the status quo? What if they push back, he mused, doubt creeping in. What if they prefer silos to collaboration? George met his gaze with unwavering confidence. "That's a risk worth taking. But you also hold the reins, Mark. You have the power to steer this. And even if they push back, the conversation itself could lay the foundation for change." Mark's heart thumped audibly. The belief churning within him felt magnetic. He had ignited a spark, and now it was time to kindle a flame. But lurking behind the newfound excitement was a nagging fear, a reluctance to confront those who might resist.
As Mark stood up, resolve illuminating his face, he realized that the most profound changes always came with discomfort. But the question lingered. Would he embrace discomfort for the sake of growth, or would he falter in the face of adversity when the time came to put his plan into action? George could see the vivid shadows of doubt layering Mark's face, and he wondered what the tide of resistance might reveal. Would courage indeed guide the illusory footsteps of corporate duty? Mark had hardly slept that night, the visions brewing in his mind, tumbling over one another like rushed leaves in a tempest. He felt alive yet petrified, a contradiction that pinned him in place more than any suit and tie ever had. The moment of truth was looming, and he sensed the weight of his decision pressing against his chest like a heavy boulder. As dawn pierced through the glass walls of his office, Mark arrived early, hoping to find a moment of solitude before the tidal wave of thoughts and opinions surged in. The stillness in the office felt fragile, almost welcoming, allowing him one last moment to perfect his strategy. But doubts crept in again. Was he prepared for the unexpected? He opened his laptop, scrolling through endless notes from the brainstorming session. The narrative of connection, trust, and storytelling swirled like an endless loop. Could he genuinely trust his employees to share their truths? He felt a knot hardening in his stomach. What if it turned into chaos? What if it shattered the illusion of order he had carefully maintained? The morning dragged on, the clock ticking louder with each frame of time. The anticipated gathering of his team lay only a few hours ahead, and the pangs of anxiety tightened around him. Just then he heard a gentle knock at the door, pulling him from his spiral of worries. It was Peter, the janitor. "Good morning, Mark," Peter said, a cordial smile illuminating his features. His presence was a comfort, untainted by boardroom politics. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Mark replied, surprised by how easeful the conversation felt against the tumult of his mind. "Just preparing for a big meeting." Peter shuffled closer, cleaning supplies in hand, but Mark knew he wasn't here just for that. "You look like you have a lot on your mind. Anything I can help with?" A part of Mark scoffed internally. What could a janitor offer in this chaotic corporate world? Yet something in Peter's unwavering gaze felt disarming. "I'm trying to revamp the way we communicate in the company," Mark began hesitantly, "but I'm afraid it might blow up in my face." Peter shrugged, contemplative. "I once worked in a place with a similar vibe. Everyone was too scared to speak up."
Until one day, someone started sharing stories during lunch breaks. It changed everything. Mark raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "They connected through laughter and honesty," Peter replied, his voice steady and sincere. People began to share their struggles in ways they never would in a meeting. As a result, they came together when it counted. Sometimes you just have to break down the walls, even if it feels risky. His words hit Mark like a revelation. Here he was worried about the potential fallout, and a simple piece of advice from someone many would overlook, poised to unlock something powerful. Suddenly inspired, Mark realized he didn't need a grand presentation or complex strategies. He just needed to foster genuine connections among his team and allow them to feel safe to share. Maybe storytelling doesn't have to be polished, he considered aloud, his excitement growing. Maybe it can be raw and authentic, just like the way your story impacted me. Peter nodded, encouragingly. Exactly. People want to see the real you, flaws and all. That's where trust starts. Mark's chest swelled. That's what he had been missing. The courage to expose his vulnerabilities beyond his role as CEO. His perspective shifted like heavy clouds parting to let light through. As Peter stepped out, Mark felt the unique purpose strengthening him, to be vulnerable and authentic, even if it didn't adhere to a tightly controlled corporate image. Fueled with renewed determination, he prepared to lead the meeting with an open heart. Is this what true leadership felt like? The tension in his mind eased. Yet beneath the surface, uncertainty simmered. Would his team embrace this shift, or had he unwittingly opened the door to chaos? Questions ricocheted through his mind as he glanced at the clock. It was time. The moment had finally arrived, and as he headed to the meeting room, he could feel the exhilarating mix of fear and hope. Would the team rise to the challenge? Would they welcome his newfound vision? Or would the first spark ignite a different kind of fire, one he hadn't prepared for? Mark stepped into the meeting room, his heart pounding as he scanned the assembled faces of his team. They appeared expectant, unaware of the tempest of emotions swirling within him. Could he really initiate a transformation today? Would they support his quest for authenticity? He took a deep breath,
striving to ground himself amidst the anxiety tightening his chest. He was accustomed to commanding the room with confidence, articulating figures and charts, weaving strategies into crafted narratives where every word served a purpose. Now he found himself peeling back those layers, unsure of which direction to take. What if his vulnerability became a liability? "Thank you all for coming," he started, his voice slightly shaky, betraying his nerves. "Today I want to talk about how we communicate as a team." He paused, gauging their reactions.
The tension in the air felt palpable, each moment stretched like an elastic band ready to snap. Mark continued, "We've been operating under the assumption that if we just stick to the agenda, focus on metrics and objectives, we will succeed. But I think we've lost something essential along the way." He hesitated again, drawing from the reservoir of courage that Peter's words had ignited within him. "I want us to start sharing our stories, raw, unpolished truths." There it was, out in the open. A murmur swept through the group. Questions danced in their eyes, the familiar fear of the unknown evident as he felt the immediate resistance looming. Was he ready for this? Would he be able to handle their responses, the pushback that might come? "I know this seems unorthodox," Mark pressed on, trying to read the room. "But what if, instead of only focusing on our roles, we connect as human beings? Perhaps we can build trust through sharing our experiences." "Mark, that sounds risky," Jenna, the head of marketing, piped up. "What if it leads to chaos here? We could end up with emotional roller coasters in meetings instead of productive discussions." Her words struck a chord within him. He had feared chaos, yet here it was, surfacing in the form of doubt among his team. How could he convince them? Could he confront this challenge, or would he retreat to the safety of traditional structures? "I understand your concerns," Mark replied, swallowing hard. "But consider this. Every successful team I've ever witnessed thrived through connection and trust. They inspired one another through their stories, fostering a culture where failures and successes were shared openly." The room was silent, tension thick enough to cut. Then he thought of Peter, how unassuming wisdom had provided clarity when he needed it most. The moment pulled at him, urging him to step deeper into unfamiliar territory. "I'm willing to open up about my own experiences. Vulnerability takes courage, and I hope you'll join me." As he began to share a personal story, something remarkable happened. His team began listening intently, their initial hesitation fading as he bared his insecurities. For the first time, they caught a glimpse of the man behind the title. Laughter bubbled up at a self-deprecating anecdote about a misstep he had once made, breaking the ice that had held them in its grip. Their faces softened, and slowly the wall he had feared shattered. With that first crack of vulnerability, the atmosphere shifted as others began to share their stories. The flow was tentative at first, but each revelation built on the last, creating a tapestry of self-discovery and connection. Mark felt a warmth spreading through the room, a sense of camaraderie washing over the participants. Yet as the meeting unfolded, another concern began to nag at him. Would they hold these stories close and be ready to embrace the collective change that this openness demanded? The sharing felt liberating, yet Mark couldn't shake the anxiety of walking a tightrope without a safety net. As they wrapped up, an overwhelming sense of accomplishment flooded Mark's senses, but it was dampened by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Could this newfound connection withstand the inevitable challenges to come, or would old habits creep back into their corporate practices? Would he be able to maintain this momentum, or was this a fleeting moment of clarity before returning to business as usual? Only time would tell, as Mark gathered his things, the echoes of their stories still ringing in his ears. The path ahead loomed, uncertain but filled with potential. He knew he had embarked on something significant, but the question loomed larger. Was he prepared to lead them through the turbulence that authenticity might bring? The clock was ticking, and Mark's heart raced as he pondered the next step on this journey into uncharted territory. Mark sat at his desk, the aftermath of the meeting reverberating around him. The excitement of unearthing such vulnerability, the fresh connections he had begun to forge with his team, was overshadowed by the looming challenge of sustaining it. The reality was sinking in. Vulnerability was only the beginning. Maintaining that open dialogue would require more than a single meeting. It called for a culture shift. As he scrolled through his notes, he couldn't shake Jenna's words. Chaos. The word hung heavily in his mind, a constant reminder of the consequences of dismantling established structures. He had opened a door, but how could he ensure they wouldn't walk straight back through it? He began mapping out a strategy, determined to turn this momentary connection into a lasting change. Each entry in his notebook became an action point, rather than mere reflections. Monthly story-sharing sessions, one-on-one check-ins, establishing a confidential platform for team members to share concerns. Each idea flowed naturally as he tapped into that lingering energy. Progress, however, didn't come without its challenges. Every step forward seemed 2 steps back. After a week, cracks began to show. Mark overheard Jenna and a few colleagues murmuring doubts about opening up so often, questioning whether such discussions really belonged in the workplace. Their comments struck a nerve, igniting another wave of doubt within him. What if they backslid? What if the very openness he sought to cultivate became hazardous instead? In the midst of his uneasiness, an unexpected moment arose one afternoon. He headed to the restroom, heading back to his office when he spotted Jason, the janitor, busy cleaning the hallway. Jason had been with the company for years, typically overlooked and on the periphery of daily operations. However, Mark felt compelled to pause. He had witnessed the man diligently working, often unnoticed, even more so after the year's performance reviews were posted.
"Hey, Jason," Mark called out as he approached. Jason straightened, a slight smile breaking through the exhaustion etched on his face. "Mr. Turner, everything all right?" "Actually, yes. Just wanted to check in. I've been thinking about how we work together as a team." "About the stories?" Jason interjected, catching Mark slightly off guard. "Exactly. What do you think?" Jason shrugged, leaning on his mop. "I've seen teams come and go. You know, it's all too easy for people up there," he gestured upwards, signaling Mark's executive office, "to forget what it's like down here. Stories can help, but they aren't magic." Mark nodded, absorbing the weight of Jason's words. "What do you mean?" "People always focus on solutions laid out in fancy reports, but sometimes the answer's in the grit. You learn things by living it, not just talking about it." "Are you suggesting I focus more on practicality?" Mark asked, intrigued by Jason's perspective. "Not just practicality. Improvement happens when you realize that everyone's got an important part to play. Sometimes you need to listen to the janitor to see the bigger picture." It struck him. Jason's straightforward insight challenged Mark's assumptions. He had been wallowing in his fears while a solution lay within the very teams he felt were slipping away. Jason's wisdom echoed the importance of merging the human element with pragmatic approaches. "Thank you, Jason. I really appreciate your perspective," Mark replied. As he walked away, rejuvenated by this unexpected encounter, an idea sparked. Mark envisioned a Voices from the Floor initiative that encouraged insights from all employees, elevating voice beyond titles, incorporating practicality into his strategy of openness. Not only would it delight his team, he'd include everyone in shaping this transformation, a true cultural shift that might spark meaningful change. The concept ignited a hunger in Mark to put practical systems in place. He felt excitement swell within him, cutting through the tension of previous days. As he prepared for the presentation of this new initiative, Mark realized that he was not just leading his team, he was cultivating a new identity for himself, a leader who valued every voice in his organization. But before he could unveil his plans, another unexpected challenge arose. He discovered murmurs of dissent brewing among his management team, growing skeptical of his newfound approach. Would they embrace or actively resist this radical shift he was trying to inspire? Mark's pulse quickened at the thought of a confrontation that loomed just beyond the horizon, a showdown that could either solidify his journey or unravel the very transformation he hoped to sustain. Mark spent the next few days wrestling with the growing unease that pulsed through the management team. Each whispered comment he caught drifted into his thoughts like errant darts, fueling his dread. Trust, he reminded himself, was a fragile asset, and he felt as though he was standing at the precipice of a thrilling venture, one wrong move away from a disastrous plunge. As the day drew near for him to present the Voices from the Floor initiative, he found himself pacing in his office, thoughts spiraling. How would his managers react? They were not just peers, but established leaders steeped in tradition, their expertise honed in an environment that prized order over vulnerability. Would they see this initiative as a celebration of inclusivity or a chaotic breach of their carefully maintained status quo? His internal monologue shifted to visions of the roundtable discussion he would be initiating. But then, images scattered, giving way to reminders of his past leadership failures, the moments when attempts at change had met staunch resistance.
Memories burned in his consciousness, goals unmet, visions unrealized, and now he stood on the threshold of possibly repeating his history. Yet there was also Jason's unyielding perspective, the janitor's voice that had dared to highlight the importance of listening to the unheard. Mark had been trapped in a cycle of anxiety, focused on potential fallout rather than on fostering an inclusive culture. He inhaled deeply, culling his determination from the flickering embers of inspiration ignited during their conversation. That afternoon, when he gathered his management team, he felt the weight of unceremonious gazes linger on him, their skepticism tangible. With a steady voice, he forged ahead, laying out the vision for Voices from the Floor. "Imagine," he began, glancing across the table where his team sat with guarded expressions, "a culture where every employee feels empowered to contribute their insights. This initiative will root our growth in the thoughts of every individual here, just as Jason said. It marries our pragmatism with innovation." The room stirred. Some eyebrows rose skeptically, while others furrowed. Mark pressed on, exuding confidence he barely felt. "This culture shift won't be comfortable instantly, but it will generate authentic connections that can innovate our strategies and foster resilience." A moment of silence followed, his words hanging in the air as tension crackled. He braced for the inevitable backlash, but instead, Jenna, who had been one of the murmurers, spoke up. "What about control? There's a balance we need to maintain. What if this leads us into chaos?" The question struck a chord of impending conflict. Mark steadied himself, mindful not to dismiss her legitimate concern. "That's valid." He shifted gears, opening the floor. "What would make you feel safe in this new environment? How can we maintain structure while encouraging voices?" The dialogue that followed was both exhilarating and daunting. Questions darted back and forth, revealing layers of hidden fear and unresolved issues, but also igniting moments of genuine curiosity. Ideas flourished amid the uncertainty, illuminating pathways to address those very fears. When he finally looked around the room, he recognized something nestled under their skepticism, a flicker of engagement, of willingness to experiment with radical openness. Yet with that realization came the stark acknowledgement that not all voices would be so easily won. Several managers remained rigid, their experienced apprehensions palpable. As he closed the meeting, Mark felt a spark of progress igniting within the confines of doubt, exhilarating yet precarious. But the unsettling notion gnawed at him. The dissent he sensed was merely simmering beneath the surface, anxieties flaring without resolution. What if the very openness he sought was a double-edged sword? Ahead loomed the critical engagement with management, where real opposition awaited. He knew the moment of reckoning was around the corner. As his hand trembled ever so slightly, Mark realized he had nudged the first domino. The question was not if they would fall, but what pattern that fall would yield. And therein lay the tension that wound tightly inside him. Could he rally their power, or had he dared to awaken a tempest he could not control? In the weeks that followed the introduction of the Voices from the Floor initiative, Mark Turner felt the tumultuous ripple of change within the company. There were moments of vibrant engagement and the stirring of inventive ideas, but equally there were fierce pockets of resistance, voices clinging to the status quo, wary of stepping into the unknown. Every meeting became an exercise in navigating the fraught landscape between innovation and hesitation. Yet amid the tension, Mark felt a transformation taking root in himself. No longer did he merely wear the title of CEO. He was engaged, becoming a facilitator of ideas rather than a mere arbiter of direction. That paradigm shift was subtle but profound. Just last week, he had hosted an open forum where employees could share ideas candidly. The energy was electric, and as he stood back, witnessing his colleagues share insights, vulnerabilities, and hope, he felt invigorated. Yet familiar doubts lingered. What about the skeptics? If the prevailing energy shifted back, what structural support would he have to prevent regression? Now, facing a pivotal meeting with his management team, the urgency sat heavy in the air. What he sensed was not just a test of his initiative, but a test of his leadership. He needed to bridge the divide between the forward momentum he felt from the team and the anxieties expressed by some leaders. Would he find a common ground or ignite a fracture? He entered the conference room with a steadiness that belied the turmoil inside. As the team settled, Their initial skepticism was clear. Folded arms, skeptical glances. Mark cleared his throat, determined to cut through the unsettled atmosphere.
Today, I want to address the concerns expressed about our Voices from the Floor initiative, he began, looking each member in the eye, seeking connection. This isn't just about sharing stories. It's about creating a more authentic and resilient workplace. He could feel Jenna's eyes bore into him, and he continued, I understand the fears of chaos, of losing control, but let's consider, isn't there chaos inherent in our silence? The voices of our employees matter most. They lend insight and strength to our identity. If we allow fear to dictate our course, we risk losing our pulse. A silence filled the room, and Mark sensed the tension vibrate. Let's do this together. Make a conscious effort to engage authentically, but also ensure we're setting frameworks that foster productivity. We can build a structure around openness rather than stifle it. Mark's heart raced as Jenna finally broke the silence. What would that structure look like? Are we rule-making or rule-bending? Both, Mark replied, the thrill of debate electrifying him. We can also evolve these guidelines as we go. Let's build a feedback mechanism that allows everyone to voice concerns while continuing to innovate. Change is uncomfortable, but without it, we stagnate. As the discussion unfolded, it felt less like a confrontation and more like a coalition forming. Voices that had been skeptical began drawing connections on how an alignment between structure and openness could lead to new efficiencies. Each contribution solidified Mark's approach. Not only did they perceive the value in transformation, they were shaping it. Finally, after what felt like hours, Mark saw a breakthrough. A young manager from the sales team, Tyler, stood with hesitance. I've seen the hesitancy, but I realize we are all here for a reason. Let's create an open invitation for every employee to pitch ideas informally, perhaps a quarterly showcase? His voice quivered, but rang with conviction. Yes, Mark exclaimed, exhilaration bubbling inside. Let's launch our Innovation Forum, where everyone can pitch not just once a year, but quarterly to ensure ideas keep flowing. The clamoring enthusiasm was palpable. As the meeting concluded, the applause echoed, a fleeting moment of cohesion that felt monumental. Not only had they turned mutual anxiety into synergy, but they had also risen as a team framed in a collective vision. There was no longer a chasm separating them, but a bridge emerging from shared vulnerability and growth. For Mark, the most significant transformation lay in realizing that leadership was not about asserting authority. It was about listening, evolving, and co-creating a culture where every individual felt empowered. The company wasn't merely his, it belonged to everyone, and in giving away some control, he had actually gained much more. As he left that meeting room, he experienced a deep sense of fulfillment.
He had conquered internal fears which once overshadowed his ability to lead authentically. He was no longer just observing waves of change. He had become an active participant, and in doing so, discovered a robust resilience within himself and his organization. With new resolve, Mark scheduled follow-ups, eager to nurture the burgeoning connections. He could feel the foundation of their corporate culture shifting, anchored in trust and open dialogue. This was not merely a plan, it was a commitment, and he was finally ready to lead it. Amid this victory of personal and professional rebirth, Mark's confidence rang with clarity. He was not just a CEO trapped by the weight of expectation. He had proven to himself that transformation began at the most authentic level, where vulnerability met courage, a duality that could ignite far-reaching change. Now, more than ever, he knew his impact extended beyond spreadsheets and figures. It lay in realizing the power of genuine connection and the responsibility of fostering it within even the most rigid corporate frameworks. Now that you've witnessed this incredible journey of overcoming challenges, we urge you to embrace your own growth. Subscribe immediately to the channel to not miss the next exclusive emotional stories that awaken your potential. Leave a like now to feed the algorithm and support impactful storytelling that resonates. Comment your reactions and theories about Mark's journey and how you relate to his transformation. Share instantly this video with at least 5 friends who need to see this conclusion and ignite their own stories of personal growth. This is the moment to show your support and spread the message. Don't wait even one more second.